Sidney Jordan was born in 1928 in Balfour Street, Dundee, now part of the university campus. He then moved to Killin Avenue and began his education nearby at Rockwell School. Like most boys of the time, he was an avid reader of the adventure comics published in Dundee by D.C. Thomson, and he was particularly inspired by a 1939 story in the Hotspur called The Last Rocket to Venus. Sidney's family moved to Malvina Place in Perth shortly before the war, and he attended Balhousie School and then Perth Academy. It was while there that he met his lifelong friend and collaborator Willie Patterson. Willie revealed both his imagination and his technical ingenuity by rigging up, in Sidney's words, a clandestine telephone link along the rung of wire fencing between our houses, powered by dry cell batteries and utilising ex-GPO earphones and large carbon granule mics. As the nights drew in, we could sit snugly in bed and talk to one another at a time when few families in the area had legitimate telephones. Inevitably, the local paper got wind of it, and the post office, while admiring our enterprise, invoked the law, and we were obliged to desist. A few months after the end of the war, Sidney's fascination for flight led him to study at the newly established Miles Aeronautical Technical School at Woodley near Reading. Willie Patterson joined him there, and the two studied aviation technology and design together for 3 years. In 1948, Sidney completed the course, but decided against a career in the aircraft industry. Instead, he returned to Dundee, where he joined the recently established Strathmore Studios, a freelance comics and illustration company run by artists Bill McHale, who knew Sidney's father, and Len Fullerton. Other artists there included George Blow, Gilbert Dunlop and Sam Thayer. Speaking in a 1973 interview, Sidney recalled, "I got a job in a little studio in Dundee working for a chap who'd known my father before the war. Now I found myself in a group of very professional artists who'd all in their day worked for D.C. Thomson, and they were really masters of the comic, as the comic existed then in D.C. Thomson publications. They were all very fine artists, and I salute them now because they did push me along the road. They really showed me a great deal about technique, but it didn't take me long to realise that the style of their comics was very staid and very old-fashioned because of the demands of the market at the time. I began at this time to study the American comics, the colour sections, and I could see that that was the direction in which I wished to go." Sidney singled out the strips Terry and the Pirates and Steve Canyon by Milton Caniff as particular favourites, as well as the art of Alex Raymond. "Raymond was a very influential artist in my early days for me," he later recalled. "One of the chaps in Dundee, Len Fullerton, who was a great naturalist artist but could also draw very fine comic stuff, he introduced me to Raymond's Flash Gordon because he had a great deal of them which he'd saved over the years." Fullerton's own art was also an important influence, particularly his mastery of scraperboard. Around 1950, Fullerton helped Sidney to devise a strip of his own called Orion, about a pilot sent to investigate a UFO sighting, which he originally drew using scraperboard. Meanwhile, Sidney was beginning to get professional work, starting with a strip for the Sunday Mail in Glasgow called Dora, Tony and Liz, which began in 1951. He also started doing work for Amalgamated Press in London, and it was while on a visit there in 1952 that his work got noticed by the directors of the Bailey-Sister Group, Ernest Bendel Bailey and Eric Sister. Impressed by his portfolio, they gave him a job with a guaranteed weekly wage of £20, a fortune at a time when the average weekly wage was only £9. At Bailey-Sister, Sidney shared a studio with other notable artists, including Tony Weir, who drew Matt Marriott for the Evening News, and Jim Holdaway, who drew Modesty Blaze for the Evening Standard. Sidney began work on a monthly comic called Dick Hercules of St Markham's, about a super-fit schoolboy. But he was also continuing to develop his early Orion idea, and the studio pitched it to Max Aitken, a director of the Daily Express, who commissioned a daily strip from him on condition that he make the main character an RAF pilot called Jeff Hawke and get rid of the Flash Gordon-inspired costumes that featured in Orion. Jeff Hawke launched in the Express in February 1954, at a time when the public were fascinated by space exploration. The British space programme had formally launched 2 years earlier. Sidney recalled that the first story was a bit like Flash Gordon, but it gradually developed into quite a scientific exercise, trying to relate the stories to current events. In 1959, an episode of the strip famously predicted the date of the moon landing within 2 weeks. In 1973, Sidney claimed, "The strip is very firmly placed now with one foot in science fact and the other in science fiction." From the start, the distinctive visual style of the strip made it more appealing to adults, in contrast to the other celebrated science fiction series of the time, Dan Dare, which first appeared in The Eagle in 1950. In particular, Sidney introduced moody lighting effects and was one of the first British comics artists to use the screen tone transfer process, then known as zipatone. "I've always used tints," he later explained. "Plenty of people can draw in a very classic way in black and white, so there's no percentage in being just another good liner. Now, I've always been more conscious of the atmosphere. It's the difference between plucking out a tune on a guitar with a single string and playing chords on it. I'm trying to get a broad impression, falling short of photographic reality, but also not going into the mechanical business of producing tone by a shading with lines. Ron Embleton once called me the master of the effect, and I think I'd like to be remembered as that." Originally, Sidney wrote the Jeff Hawke stories himself. He later said, "I always thought of myself as a writer who can draw a wee bit." But after 2 years, he invited his old school friend Willie Patterson to take over the scripting. Willie had moved to London soon after Sidney and was working in an editorial role on the Children's Encyclopedia, published by Amalgamated Press. For about 18 months, he'd been feeding ideas into the strip unofficially before being formally employed as a writer in 1956. Together, Sidney and Willie's work on Jeff Hawke pushed the boundaries of science fiction comics. They avoided the bug-eyed monsters of popular fiction and created more intelligent and satirical stories featuring sophisticated alien worlds and characters. Willie brought in his love of classical history, literature, philosophy and aeronautics. Sidney recalled, "Willie had an understanding of contemporary science that was married to a profound and educated interest in classical history and philosophy, and this was the wellspring of his talent. We got on extremely well because Willie and I both had the same upbringing, we enjoyed the same things, and he had that imaginative way of looking at life that was good for a comic strip. But I think that in choosing a science fiction theme, I did myself a service because it means that I'm never stuck for an exotic locale. I'm not lumbered with a detective who has to pick up clues. I can have a detective story, or a love story, or a space opera. I can do anything. I'm very fortunate that way." Sidney has freely admitted that the character of Jeff Hawke himself was, in his words, pretty one-dimensional, but the series was constantly enlivened by a galaxy of more memorable creations, including the arch-villain Chalcedon and the verbose and bureaucratic Colverok, who's forever humiliated by him. As Jeff Hawke's popularity grew, the Sunday Express also wanted a strip. In 1960, in order to manage the extra workload expected, Sidney asked another Dundee-born comics artist, Colin Andrew, to help him with the art on the daily strip. Andrew worked on 2 stories, but when the Sunday strip idea was abandoned, he moved on to other projects, including further collaborations with Willie Patterson. During the 1960s, Willie was working on numerous other strips, as well as Jeff Hawke, but the heavy workload and the increasing separation from his wife and family, who were still living in Perth, had a serious effect on his mental health. In 1969, following the fashion of the times, the Express demanded the strip be sexed up with the inclusion of more female characters, preferably scantily clad. Willie disagreed and eventually quit. His depression got worse, meaning that he was unable to write, and he went into a long decline before his early death in 1986, aged just 57. Sidney wrote, "Of the 2 of us, his was the unique talent, and what was to come cannot detract from what had been. Willie was a man who saw beyond the skies to the stars." Willie's departure in 1969 was a bitter blow for Sidney, who took over scripting duties again, with Nick Forey joining to help with the art. Nick was a close friend of Sidney's who shared a love of fast cars, which often made it into the strips. In 1973, Martin Asbury, more recently a successful film storyboard artist, also assisted. Following a change of management in 1974, the Daily Express suddenly decided to drop the strip, despite a wave of protests from its many fans. The newly established Scottish Daily News continued to publish it for another year, but it folded in 1975. The strip then briefly continued in syndicated form for one final story, with art assistance from Brian Boland and Paul Neary, both later to become hugely successful in American comics. Another Scottish paper then came to Sidney's aid. In 1976, the Daily Record commissioned a new science fiction series, originally called Earthspace, featuring a Scottish central character, Lance MacLean. This was very different from Jeff Hawke, a grim post-apocalyptic saga in which the remaining humans live on Mars, the remains of a damaged moon, and various spaceships and orbiting space stations. Duncan Loonan helped with the stories, and Thayan Rich assisted with the art. The strip went into colour in 1980, but was finally dropped by the Daily Record, mid-story, in 1988. Despite their considerable differences from the original Jeff Hawke series, many of the Lance McLean stories were retitled Jeff Hawke for syndication, including publication in the Daily Express. But the biggest success for both strips was not in the UK, but in Europe. Jeff Hawke appeared in various editions in France, Germany, Spain and Sweden, and became particularly popular in Italy. As a result, the series had a considerable impact on the development of European science fiction. Over the years, Sydney's been honoured with numerous Life Achievement Awards and other prizes in Italy, France, Belgium and Spain. Today, Italian publishers continue to reprint both Jeff Hawke and Lance McLean stories, but in the UK only a handful of Jeff Hawke stories are still in print thanks to 2 compilations from Titan Books. In 2001, the Jeff Hawke Club was founded with the aim of bringing the stories to a wider public. They have since reprinted many more of the strips in their magazine. Our exhibition presents a selection of original art from Jeff Hawke and Lance McLean strips from the collection of Alistair Hunter, along with some of Sydney's uncompleted projects and other material on loan from the artist himself. We hope you enjoy entering this extraordinary world of imagination. Thanks for listening.